Many thanks and a warm welcome to everybody. As Sally said, this is day 2 and session 3 of our annual summit. It's virtual again, obviously, and we're so pleased that over 3,000 people have signed up to watch our 10 sessions. That's over 800 people over the course of the week, and we're expecting about 300 people who've signed up for this session, many of whom will watch it live, as you are, and others who will watch a recording of it. The session is all about Better Engaged, a place to live. It follows on and builds on a session that we held yesterday afternoon called People and Place and Connected Communities. And for those of you who were able to join us, that session really challenged us to think about institutional levers and citizen-led levers to enable change to happen. You'll be familiar with some of the things then that Cormac Russell had said about the hydraulics of power and that relationship between organisations and citizens. Well, it's something we want to explore a bit further today about where we live and how do we engage with our residents, our customers, our consumers, both in terms of the services that they wish and want, how we deliver those, but also how do we value the outcomes that we can deliver at a local level, both in the homes, the communities that we live in and the wider neighbourhood. Something that very much aspires to our philosophy of collaborate at the HousingLIN. Now, we have a session in 2 halves, and we're really great that this session is sponsored by ExtraCare Charitable Trust, and we're joined by Michael Spellman from there. And Michael, on behalf of the HousingLIN, thanks for your continued support of the LIN. In fact, we have a series of sponsors enabling us to run this summit during the course of the week. We have 4 headline sponsors at the top of this page: Guinness, Tunstall, UKRI and Lovell Later Living, and our associate sponsors, including ExtraCare Charitable Trust and a number of others who, as I said, have enabled us to make this possible. Well, this session, as I said, is in 2 parts, and we're going to put the spotlight on the work of ExtraCare Charitable Trust and some of the real influential work I think has come out over the last few years, both during COVID, but also over a series of and over a number of years in terms of the way they both engage with their existing residents, but the communities that they operate in. Something that the HousingLIN has explored through some of their work through Steps to Connection. And Michael Spellman is going to kick off today. He's the Wellbeing Research and Innovation Lead Manager at the ExtraCare Charitable Trust. But part 2 also is going to have a wider look. And we've got an international flavour from Wilhelmina Hoffman, who's president of the Dementia Centre in Stockholm and works very closely on the Queen of Sweden's charity around dementia. And we'll hear from Wilhelmina. She's also been a panel member of our TAPI project, so it's really great to have her back here again. And then we'll also be joined by Robin Hewings, who's the Programme Director of Campaign to End Loneliness. We're going to touch on some of the work and the influential work they've done around thinking about loneliness in the wider context in terms of the built environment. And as I said at the outset, some things around quality of life and looking at the better outcomes. We're going to hear from Matthew Morgan, the Director at the Quality of Life Foundation, to understand a bit of the work they're doing around developing frameworks and working closely in communities to capture that evidence. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Michael. And thanks again for all your support, Michael, not just for today, but over the course of the year and years.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. So and especially to talk about a project that I'm very, very passionate about, and a project that was kind of handed to me actually in my former role in ExtraCare as the Dementia and Mental Wellbeing Lead around loneliness. Just to give you a bit of an idea of the kind of setting that the project took place in first, though. So an ExtraCare village, you're looking at around 260 plus apartments around a village centre, which has got lots of different communal facilities there. So lots of opportunity for people to mix and be socially engaged. But obviously we know that isn't always the case for some people. Some people will still remain lonely, even in a setting like that. But just a population of about 300 odd residents living in a village like that, just to kind of set the scene a little bit, so you know the sort of size and scale of the location that this project took place in. Loneliness obviously connected to mental well-being, and that was obviously my former role. Being handed a project around loneliness, I was a bit tentative to begin with. It's actually one of the topics that I think is can be very, very tricky to do something about. It feels that way anyway. There's so many negative associations with older people and loneliness, and just a few things on the screen here. It can sometimes feel like a bit of a, how on earth are we going to do something about loneliness and older people? What's our starting point going to be? And when loneliness was the starting point, myself and the project officer on this project, Michael Roberts, it was a bit of a head scratcher. So we really had to kind of flip it and try and look at, well, the opposite of loneliness. What else is there? What can life look like? And what would we like life to look like for people? What happens or stops happening before a person starts to feel lonely? So let's stick loneliness at the bottom of the page, almost ignore it to a certain extent, and let's do a project about loneliness that kind of has as little to do with loneliness as possible. What are the things that a person needs in their life to feel socially engaged, to feel like they're connected, to feel like they're enjoying life, and to feel confident to form new relationships? How can a person focus on the things that are stopping them from doing that? What do they actually want their older age to look like? What do they want their retirement to look like? What kind of things would they like to do? And what practical steps can they actually take to overcome any of the barriers to getting to that point? And that lovely phrase, which I can't remember where it comes from now, but being alone actually becoming a choice. Because yes, sometimes it is nice to be alone. It's nice to be able to close your front door on the world and have time for you. So this is really more what we wanted the project to look like. We even actually changed the name of the project. When we first made the submission to the funder, it was called the Confronting Loneliness Project, which, looking back, really just felt like quite a negative title. Didn't really kind of show what we wanted to do. So it became the Engaged Lives Project, very much about building confidence, building a community and feeling like you're part of a community. And the building confidence part was really massive. Michael Roberts, the person who led the project, was a doctor in mindfulness as his background. I'm a psychotherapist by background, so we were very much around, let's look at confidence, let's look at negative thinking styles, let's look at all of those things that lead to loneliness. Let's go back to the very start. We were really lucky as well to have the funding from the Big Lottery Community Fund. They funded the project for the full 3 years, and that funding enabled us to really kind of do something I don't think we would have been able to have done without that funding, particularly in the kind of the quality of documents that we were able to develop as a result of that funding. The main part of the project that we wanted to deliver, I said the project lasted between summers 2019 and 2022. Engaged Lives workshops. We actually wanted to get residents face to face together in a room with Dr. Michael Roberts and go through a series of workshops focusing on what are the barriers that those individuals are facing when it comes to being more socially engaged. What are the problems and how can any of those be removed? So those Engaged Lives workshops were held once a week for 6 weeks, no more than groups of 10 residents in the room, because we wanted everyone to have quite an individual focus. And we developed a resource pack as well that the resident could use as they moved through the weeks. And there was actually quite a bit of homework involved as well. So you can see all of the titles of the weeks on the screen in front of you. A vision of engagement. Well, what would you like life to look like? What would your week normally look like, if you were being more social and doing the kind of things you wanted to do? That was a good starting point. We looked at physical frailty, physical mobility. What are the practical problems there? How do I overcome them? Weeks 3 and 5 were particularly popular, challenging our negative thinking styles. We included elements of CBT, so cognitive behavioural therapy, and also mindfulness into these sessions in a very light way, in a very non-clinical way, but really looking at that principle was, if we change the way we think, it can change the way we feel, and that can change how we actually behave and what we do. So we really started to look at challenging negative thinking styles, which we can easily fall into. And if you just Google loneliness and older people, like on that first slide that I showed, so many negative things come up. It's very easy to fall into a negative thinking style when we're thinking about loneliness. Building resilience, again, both physical and emotional resilience was very important. Confidence came up time and time again, as I don't necessarily have the confidence to walk into somewhere like the cafe bar and strike up conversations with people that I don't know. I've not had to do that since I was at work. I've not had to do that since my children were at school and I was constantly coming into contact with different adults. Actually moving into a retirement community can be an amazing thing, but it can also be a bit of a, well, where do I start? You know, how do I just all of a sudden start to make friends and develop a community? So we worked a massive amount on confidence. And then week 6, looking forwards, how do we actually make some of these changes sustainable? What can you keep doing? And the resource pack was a really important part of that. The Engaged Life workbooks here, it covered each week of the session. Residents would bring their workbook to their session with them. It would have all of the information in there that we were talking about in the workshops, but also exercises for residents to complete outside of the workshop and actually start trying to put these things that they were learning into practice and trying to challenge themselves, trying to do something that week that was going to push the envelope a little bit more. What we found from these sessions, if my slides move forward. So yeah, what we found from these sessions was that people started to actually make some friendships outside of the group, which was what we were hoping for. Just want to go back to this last slide for you, just so I can show you these outcomes. Ooh. They're not appearing. These are some of the actual bits of feedback the residents said about the session. So after a session would finish, people would often go and have lunch together and that kind of thing. So they were building up a few social connections from the group itself, as well as then challenging themselves outside of the group to do a little bit more together. People really quite like the work that focused on the way they think and how they feel. It's not necessarily something that had been done with many of the residents before that. Actually, they might have, for instance, been sent a befriender if they were feeling lonely, and they could have time with that individual for a couple of hours a week. But then what about the bits in between? What do I actually do then? And many people quite like that idea that actually, so I can be part of making the situation better. I don't necessarily have to wait for someone like a befriender or a member of staff to come to me and help me not to be lonely anymore, to rescue me. Actually, I can do a lot of these things myself. And some of the outcomes again here, when we actually measured how a person was doing before they joined the sessions, we then measured them. The session was 6 weeks, so 6 weeks, another 6 weeks after that. So 12 weeks was week 1, how's the person getting on? Week 12, making a comparison using the UCLA loneliness scale and the Warwick and Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale. These were a couple of the percentages that came out of that. On the social wellbeing scores, they didn't increase as much as we thought they would. There's a 5.5% increase. The biggest increase came from general wellbeing. So even though the person's circumstance hadn't changed that much, they hadn't maybe made lots more friends or got really engaged in the community and started doing lots of new things, they were feeling better about the situation. Some of the feedback we had around that was 6 weeks could have been maybe 10 or 12 weeks. It would have been nicer to work in the group for longer, but also that some of the issues that the people were facing in terms of being less socially connected were quite deep ingrained issues, and it was going to take probably a lot longer than 12 weeks for that to be unpicked. But we did take it as a positive that people were feeling better about the situation that they were in. People were feeling more positive, and that although I haven't made lots of friends in these last 12 weeks or started doing lots more in these last 12 weeks, I know that I can, I know that it's possible, and I know that I'm gradually challenging myself to do a bit more that's going to end up giving me the kind of lifestyle and the kind of social engagement that I actually want. The second big part of the project was developing what we called our community team. So we piloted this in 2 villages, one village in Coventry in the Midlands and Longbridge in Birmingham, another village in the Midlands. We wanted to develop some new volunteer roles so that villages had the option to replace their existing befriender roles. That more kind of traditional, will provide an hour of support or 2 per week, but then what happens in between? There was 3 volunteer roles. So the community coordinator basically kept the team organised. So they helped up with matching residents who were lonely to volunteers. The community builder, who focused much more on groups and actually bringing people together, particularly residents who necessarily couldn't engage that well one-to-one or engage with the written material. So residents with cognitive problems or dementia or issues around kind of mood and well-being. The group setting seemed to work much better for residents with those needs, and a group that was facilitated to kind of help make conversations and connections between people who were attending. And then the third role, the Friendly Faces volunteer. So that was the replacement for our traditional befriender role, focusing very much on one-to-one support and really using the kinds of things that we were talking about in the Engaged Lives workshop, challenging the person a bit more, doing some goal setting, actually getting the person to think about what barriers they faced and how could that actually be changed. There's about 5 core principles that we developed for actually being a Friendly Faces volunteer. And the first one was a very important one: empower individuals to make positive change without trying to rescue them. Many of the residents that we worked with said, I don't necessarily want to be described as lonely. I don't necessarily see myself as lonely, even though, yeah, I do feel lonely at times. I don't want to be seen as almost that victim, that lonely older person. I want someone who's going to challenge me and give me a push rather than just coming to see me for an hour or 2 a week. So very, very much more about empowering the person to do what they can do rather than just almost trying to cure or treat a person's loneliness. And so those projects were going very, very well. This is one part of the community team at Earlston Park, really great bunch of people who really got involved and really kind of got on board with the ethos of having a community team in the village. We saw kind of different increases in the percentage of, well, the outcomes from running this initiative in those 2 villages. For instance, this first one, residents reported that they were hardly ever or never lonely, moved from 71% to 83% after about 6 or so months of having that community team running in their village. Residents were feeling less left out, just a marginal increase there, and residents feeling more in tune with others. So we really did want to start to see some of that, well, this is actually working. And I think the Friendly Faces initiative seemed to be having more of an impact than the face-to-face Engaged Lives workshops, although I think there's definitely benefits to both. So these 2 projects were going very, very well. They were very much embedded in ExtraCare by year 2 of the 3-year project. And then, of course, this happened to all of us, didn't it? Lockdown. Running a project that was all about social connectedness, social engagement and being together was very, very difficult once we were then locked down and told that we can't leave our apartments and everyone's working from home and all those kinds of things. It felt like the absolute worst thing that could happen generally, but also just during a project like this, left myself and Michael Roberts with a real head scratcher. How do we complete our project? How do we actually still get people together and get them feeling engaged and happy whilst we're in the middle of all of this? So we developed what kind of became known as our lemonade project. You know, obviously when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade, don't you? And we thought, well, how can we use all of the materials that we've developed over the last 18 months and get them out there to people? So we basically wrote a self-help book, or a self-help guide called Steps to Connection. We took everything we'd learned during the project, everything the residents had told us in the Engaged Live sessions, all of the work we'd done around mindfulness and cognitive behavioural principles about challenging our negative thinking styles, and put them into 10 chapters in this book. We even included a chapter on staying connected digitally. So how do we actually stay connected when we can't physically leave the house? We had about 1,000 of these books printed and started to make them available within the locations so that residents themselves could sit there and use this book, complete the exercises in it, and actually start to challenge their thinking. And when they were eventually able to come out into the communal areas again, start putting these things into practice. Even stuff in there about nourishing your relationships, asking people to focus, well, what relationships have I got? You know, am I actually giving these relationships as much as I could? Are there any relationships that maybe I don't want anymore because they're not really working for me? What can I be doing differently? How can I be more socially engaged? And this was actually one of the parts of the project that we were most happy with, and it wouldn't have happened had it not been for the pandemic. But so something good can come out of something, you know, extremely negative. So what's next? What we need to do next of all of this? This project really touched about 6 or 7 of our 16 retirement villages. So for the next year, what we'll be doing is promote the volunteer community team. We need to go around to each of our villages and schemes and hold an Engaged Live event. We've just done that at one of our villages in High Wycombe, Hewenden Gardens, which went very well. We want to promote that, but those volunteer roles, get residents doing those and help the locations to set up. So ideally what we'd like to see is in every one of our locations, we've got one of those volunteer community teams. We'll be providing copies of steps to connection to residents within those villages who want them. So they can actually do that work on their own, or they can do chapters of that book with members of staff, chapters that they might find particularly useful. And we also really want to support staff and help train the staff so they can deliver the EngAGED Lives workshops. So that a couple of times a year, new residents moving in or residents already living in the village are going to have that opportunity to go to an EngAGED Live workshop if that's the method that they're going to find most useful. Collectively, we really hope these things are going to make a big push in helping us to tackle loneliness with an ExtraCare and have more residents. If they are on their own, it's through choice, and it's because they want to be alone. Thank you for listening.
Michael, thank you for a great presentation and kicking off this morning's session. And I think, you know, when we called it Better Engage, it was very much about focusing on that work, but also what you've described shows, you know, how to create really sort of valuable and meaningful places to live. Both people who weren't aware perhaps of ExtraCare and the services that you offer, but also the way that they can build connections with other residents and the community as a large. So thanks very much for sharing that. And I know there are a couple of questions already in the chat box. They're mainly sort of administrative ones, but we'll come back to those because I know that one can access some of the materials that you've described, and we can sort of highlight that later on. But it gives me great pleasure to move on from that. And you talked about people living with dementia and in your schemes. And I know you, again, as an organisation, you've done a lot of work on this. But from a citizen-led perspective, I'm delighted that Wilhelmina can join us. Wilhelmina Hoffman from Sweden, who's going to give us an international flavour, but very much focused on her work and the work of the centre, thinking about building on what you've said, Michael, but also putting into context about what's happening in Sweden. So Wilhelmina, over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm from Sweden and I will speak a little bit slower, but I will keep my 12 minutes really here today. I'm a geriatrician, and when I started to work, a lot of my patients with dementia, they couldn't be cured and they can still not be cured. And what I know also is that 2/3 of all the people with dementia in Sweden, they live in their own homes. So what we could see was that if a person could have a good environment, good quality of life, and what does that mean? It's not all about healthcare, social care, it's about a society around that accepts people with cognitive problems, but also to open the doors and make it easier to live, being a person with cognitive problems and being a family member. Next slide, please. Well, the first slide was about Swedish Dementia Center. We have been working for 15 years, and the background is really the Queen's Foundation Stiftelsen Sylvia Hemmet. It was 27 years ago when she thought that it was very difficult to be a family member, to have a mother with dementia. So she was very open with this, and she wanted to start know-how spreading like rings in the water. So the foundation, Sylvia Hemmet, has been ongoing for so many years. It has a daycare facility for people with dementia. We have a lot of basic courses for people working in home help service, for family members, for hospital, etc. We have several academic programs, which means that you undergo sometimes a master education in dementia care. And the Queen always provide the student, when they succeeded the training, with her title and the brooch. So we have so much support from our Queen, and that has been important for our work really in Sweden. And we have a certification system where we educate everyone in, for example, a nursing home, and that also includes the janitors, people working in the kitchen, people working with the cleaning. So it must be everyone involved. And we also have the internationally cooperation, mainly now in Germany, in Brazil, but also in Lithuania and India, where our education they are spread. And we also are behind the national Dementia Competence Center, Swedish Dementia Center. But what is special with this? Well, it's about quality of life. And what I told you from the start was that it's not all about the medical health. It's about the holistic way of being able to live with cognitive problem with your family, or being a family member taking care of a person with cognitive problems. So we have a care philosophy about this person-centered care, family support, and it's also so important also for us working as care professionals that we can work together with the family, with the persons with cognitive problems. They are really in the team. It's not we and them, it's always us. And I will come to the point called the Sylvia Bo concept now, because this is showing how we can work together in order to make it easier to live with difficulties in the aging process and with cognitive problems. Next slide, please. Sylvia Bo, this is an example of a building, how an apartment for a person with cognitive problem, but also for a person aging with vision problem or hearing problem, etc. And it started really 8 years ago when the founder of IKEA, Mr. Ingvar Kamprad, he was invited to Silviahemmet by the Queen. So it was a fantastic meeting with IKEA, the interior design company, together with Her Majesty. And they shared the vision that it must be possible to be able to live in a nice looking home, affordable home, but a smart home for longer time, that it must not just be to choose either living at home with support from home help service or to be in a nursing home when the dementia progressed in time. So for 6 years now, we have been really meeting the building construction company, Skanska, it's a huge company with their boklok, they're called, IKEA and Silviahemmet. So we have been discussing and how can we make a home that is suitable and still affordable and very nice looking. Next slide, please. So it must be able to still stay at home, in your home, with the loved one, if that is possible. And it should be safe, of course, and it should support your independence. And it must be very close to social activities. So the house, they were designed very close to our daycare facility, so that our Sylvia sisters, that's the name of the specially trained assistant nurses that helps people with cognitive problems, so they could assist even in the home of the person with dementia, so that the family member could still live his or her life doing his or her things. So it was a huge work done together. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of the first apartment, and when we worked together, it was a 50-point list for adaptations. What could be done without making it look like an institution, and how could IKEA is making all the interior designs, and the house building company built into the walls so that you could still, with cognitive problem, would you have your eyesight diminished, etc. So this is just an example, and this is really very nice to show Her Majesty, the Queen of Sweden, and also she's showing the King this, His Majesty of Sweden. So it's glass doors in the kitchen, so you can see what's behind. It's contrast color handles, and it's also an oven that you can, so you don't need to bend. And the floor, they are not like glazed. It's not so that you're having the reflexes. And it's also about the windows. It's about the furniture with no sharp corners, etc., etc. So this is a project, and we started so many years ago, but then the neighbors, when we have built the houses, they complained. But 1 week ago, we got the message, you can start now. So we have to rebuild something here, but we will offer our guests, we don't call them patients or something like that, they're guests in our daycare. They can start to live, and we have the research ongoing. So we will follow what is good and what is not good. And everything is, of course, done together with persons with cognitive problems. Next slide, please. The Swedish Dementia Center, that is a National Competence Center, and we celebrated 15 years last week. And that is because Sylvia Hemmet, the foundation, got so many questions about dementia. How can we make it better for people living with cognitive problems? So we are in the middle. We are not doing research. We worked close with researchers, with the academy, with the authorities and government. And on the other part, we have the person with dementia, family, care professionals, students, NGOs, etc. And we have several projects ongoing at the moment. Next slide, please. So how do we reach out? Well, we have a website, a very frequented website. We have free of charge online courses, both for healthcare staff, but also for family members. It's about to understand, also for police and security guards and for shop owners, etc. We have more than 450,000 users at the moment. We are the largest education portal in Sweden at the moment. We have books free to download, free of charge, information sheets. We have many people living in Sweden with not born in Sweden with speaking other languages. We have podcasts, we have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We have applications. We arrange conferences and seminars, and everything is free of charge, and that is very important. But we are supported by the government for this. Next slide, please. This is a type of application. We have it in English. It's about how to avoid restraints when it's a problem living together with a person that perhaps get hallucinations, perhaps something is happening so the person become aggressive. How can you do, etc. So this is in Swedish and in English, and it's free of charge. Next slide, please. This is also an application for the police, security guards, because they meet people with dementia that are perhaps sometimes in a shop and putting something in the pocket without paying, without thinking they are stealing, of course. And also if they get lost out in the city. So this has been done together with the police, and this is about the cooperation, the collaboration, interdisciplinary, really. Next slide, please. So some of our projects now, we have, for example, a book for people living with dementia directly for them, how to support the person to stay healthy and to avoid going into what can I say, to withdraw yourself. How can you keep up with your interest, be out in the society? What type of help can you ask for? We have also literature and education about aging with intellectual disability. We have been working together with the hugest museums in Sweden, the National Museum and 80 other museums. We have a library project opening up for people. We have a football project, and that's together with a football fan club. They would like to keep their fans, even if they are very old, even if they have cognitive problems. We have a music project, also a project how to shop easier for people to be still active, going to their shop without too much noise and changing of the place for the products, etc. And we have also contests for the most shop easy shop in Sweden. And we have, like I said, for police and security guards, we have education programs and also a program for dementia and communication. Next, please. So that was the signal for 12 minutes, Jeremy. I had this time.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much.
That's just an overview of what we're doing. Thank you.
Well, can I thank you, but also for saying it so fluently and articulating it so beautifully. You really gave a strong message about both the challenges that you have and how you're trying to overcome those, whether it's the building, and I'm glad to see that the residents are now not objecting, and we're going to see this happening,
Yes.
but also the reality about how to create better lives for people through not just the care, but all the other aspects of their well-being. So, you know, whether it's the football or whether it's the education. So that was really fascinating, and builds on very nicely from what Michael was saying. And I'm sure Michael may have some issues about how to, not issues, but sort of ways to sort of link in with you some of their work they're doing around this as well. So
that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll come back and explore that. But you also talked about some of the challenges around sort of addressing people's perceptions of, as they age, their ability to connect, and loneliness. And our next speaker, Robin, is going to talk a bit more on that issue around loneliness. And it's sort of, I don't know if you're there, Robin. I know you were changing desks as we, I think he is. Oh, brilliant. Yes, good to see you again. So Robin, thank you very much also for joining us this morning. And the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just give me one moment while I do that fiddly bit at the beginning, sharing my screen. Yes, so my name is Robin Hewings, and I lead the work of the campaign Loneliness. You'll just see. Right, yes. So we have been around for just over a decade, and we were set up to do three main things, which is what we still do, which is to develop evidence about loneliness in order to make a practical difference, to bring together the community of organisations who care about this issue, and also to make the case for action on this right across society, from small businesses to government to our own personal lives. I just want to say firstly that I was delighted to be invited today. I think, as we've already heard, these issues around loneliness can particularly affect people using ExtraCare housing, and I know from my own family experience what a massive difference good quality housing can make for people in later life. So I'm just going to run through a quick bits of context before then talking about some work that we've done recently about loneliness and the built environment, and how the built environment can make a real difference to the chances of someone being lonely, and why we think that the quality of the environment around us is something that can be changed so that fewer people are lonely. And it's brilliant to hear the work from the Trust about examples of action that has been taken very much in that context. So yeah, just briefly, so loneliness is subjective, it's a negative, unwelcome feeling, and it's caused by a gap between the social connections we have and those that we would like. Mainly that gap is with people, but it can also be with pets or with nature as well. And just in terms of why people are lonely, there has been a pandemic impact. It's kind of had a real impact on people's relationships, particularly if their relationships weren't so great to kick off with. Loneliness is a lot to do with change and transition. Big ones are bereavement or moving house. And so you can see why this may be particularly relevant to the people you work with. Different people react differently to different situations as well. What might be fine for one person might be different to others, and some of that is in our psychology. And also, society can exclude people or discriminate against people, and that can really, and those risk factors can really kind of layer up. So, for example, being disabled and being younger, these things can really kind of increase someone's odds of being lonely. In general, we see a kind of U-shaped distribution of loneliness. So younger people are lonelier, people in middle life are generally less lonely, and in later life, it's not so much kind of people in their 60s or early 70s. It's when kind of other issues start kind of mounting up in people's late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I think that one of the key things I was want to talk about in relation to loneliness, and I saw that this was on this diagrams and some slides earlier, that loneliness could be a kind of a downward spiral that can be difficult to get people out of. So it's both important to kind of prevent people going into that spiral, but also that if they are in that kind of bottom area, people may need particularly targeted support to get them out of it. And then I show this slide just to show the context of what we're talking about in the context of working on the built environment, which is that the set of services that can help to tackle loneliness kind of exist as a kind of as a network, as a kind of a web. And so there are services that are about finding and supporting people, such as social prescribing in the NHS or elsewhere. There are some very kind of tangible things around access to digital and transport. And there's also the kind of classic kind of things that we probably most immediately think about, kind of social groups and befriending as ways of tackling loneliness. And it was brilliant to hear about the way in which psychology was being brought in to ways of tackling loneliness earlier in this session. But I'm just going to particularly focus on the built environment. But as you can see, there's never one answer, and the things that we do about loneliness will always work best when the other things around it are really strong as well. So just like, why does it matter? Well, I think to some extent, I think that we can see here that what the local environment is, as I was just saying, is one set of factors that can make people less isolated. We can have an environment which encourages meaningful interaction, and so therefore can reduce the likelihood of loneliness. I think that we've always kind of known this. I often give the example that I live in an area that was basically built by late Victorians, and they made sure that there were parks and churches and schools on every road, so that there were places for people to kind of connect and come together. I think currently we need kind of heavy duty quantitative evidence about something, and that has really kind of come through in the last couple of years. You can see all of these references are very, very recent, and what they show in summary is that loneliness varies from one area to another, but for reasons that you can't see just on the basis that there are a lot of students there who might be more likely to be lonely, or people on the low income. So we can see that this is a difference caused by differences in areas. I think and then also talking to people who are lonely, including in kind of quantitative surveys, people who are lonely often, there's strong associations with how they feel about their environment around them. So that might be the kind of quality of the environment in terms of things like its walkability, or the kind of having things to do, places nearby. It's also to do with feelings around safety. And so, for example, antisocial behaviour can really drive loneliness. It means that people feel threatened. And obviously you can see how kind of threat and anxiety are actually quite closely related to loneliness. And obviously it makes people less likely to use them. There's no point having a park nearby if it's a park where you don't feel safe. And similarly, trust is also kind of closely related to loneliness as well. So in terms of, I've been kind of cantering through my slides at some pace, but I'm just going to kind of slow it down a little bit as we kind of move on to the solutions of what we can do about this. So we think that there actually are ways in which we can either design new environments, as on the left-hand side, or retrofit existing environments to create spaces where people can better connect. That's about having places where people feel safe, that look attractive. All of these things kind of draw us in, and we have many more examples in our recent report on loneliness in the built environment. But I'm trying to make sure that I don't run over, so I'm just going to kind of move just quickly to a kind of an overall framework that we have created for this. So what you can see is that in the centre, we're talking about the what of this. So what is it that people that works to reduce loneliness? So we think that it's about walkability and bumping spaces, the kind of what we might traditionally have thought of as being the post office queue or the school gate, making sure that people can happily bump into each other, rather than places that people want to kind of get through quickly because they're noisy or they're dangerous or they're dark or they're just generally unwelcoming. But what's also important is that you have destinations for people to get to. That might be pubs or cafes, it might be libraries or community centres. But what it's about is about having the right kind of spread for different types of people to come into. And you can obviously imagine that very clearly in the kind of work that you're doing as well. And then there's an interesting role for kind of design details. Some designs can be off-putting, and other ones, for example, kind of things around can kind of draw us in because they feel welcoming and they feel interesting. And so what we think that can lead to are the kind of repeated encounters, the unstructured interactions, just that kind of happy way in which you can start to know your neighbours, walk down the street and see people, all of that kind of stuff. And then but it's also going to be more structured things and making sure that there is that rich range of ways in which we can come together. All of those things we think add up to people having a lower chance of loneliness. In terms of how we do it, we think that it's about a commitment to understanding this issue and working on it, to really involving people. I think I was hoping, as ever, that you might have some kind of one-size-fits-all thing that you can command from Whitehall, but the world is never that simple. And actually, this is something which is all about, you know, the precise place where the bench goes, where with the bus stop, and just kind of a few meters either way can make all the difference. So this is very much about deeply involving people, but I think there's also a continuing role for academic research to better understand how this works, and more on kind of what works for whom and so on. And so putting that all together, I really do think that there's a real potential for our overall environment to make a real differences to the chances of people being lonely, particularly in relation to preventing loneliness or getting people out of smaller issues with loneliness. And what that means, hopefully, is that the services that are focused on tackling loneliness can focus on those who need it most, because this is a big issue facing our society, and we need to pull all of the levers that we can in order for far fewer people to face the real issues created by chronic loneliness. So thank you for listening to me, and I do urge you to use our report and think about how it may influence your own work. Thank you.
Robin, thanks very much. And you could have had a few more minutes, because I think what you're saying is so important, but I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but I'm sure we'll come back to some of the issues that you raised in the Q&A, because I see that a couple of people have already asking general questions around spatial planning and things like that. So, you know, really fascinating, and a really great contribution to the debate we've already had. So let's come back to some of that in the Q&A and the debate, and move on to Matthew Morgan at the Quality of Life Foundation. I think we've set you up beautifully, Matthew, to capture what the work both you do, but also to tie it in back to what Robin, Wilhelmina and Michael have already presented. So the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the inviting us to come and speak today. I'm going to give you a little introduction to the work we do, and then have a look at the specific aspects of it that impact on older people. So we're the Quality of Life Foundation. We've been around for about 4 years now. We're a small charity with a trading subsidiary, and our focus is very much on a long-term approach to homes and neighbourhoods to improve outcomes for people and their quality of life. Next slide, please. So we want a housing system that prioritises people's quality of life over the long term, which means getting over some of the short-term thinking that's in both industry and government, and taking a longitudinal view of the housing system that hopefully has better outcomes for people. Next slide. What is quality of life? For us, it's a complex interweb of varying different factors that we've distilled into 6 themes, which you'll see on the next slide. These are a sense of control, health, both inside and outside the home, access to nature and biodiversity, a sense of wonder that you get through places that have a strong sense of identity, but also allow for play, movement, which has to do with what you do with cars, but also encouraging public transport and cycling and walking, and that sense of community that comes through belonging, neighborliness, and diverse communities. Next slide. So we do this by making, or we use the framework and take a long-term approach by making people's quality of life central to the way we create and care for our homes and neighbourhoods. So it's not just the planning and design, but it's then also the maintenance and long-term success of places that we're interested in. We do that through the gathering of evidence and highlighting best practice, which is the next bit, and through research, commercial services, and influencing, so that ultimately we can affect change in industry and government, and hopefully pull those kind of policy levers as well, which leads to better outcomes for society, industry, local government and national government, and ultimately better places for people, and a change in the way that we do business. So it's an approach that we've taken forward through the provision of the next slide, through the research that we do, working with community groups, developers, housing associations, universities and government, and includes literature reviews, qualitative and quantitative studies, policy reviews, and roundtable reports. These are some of the outputs that we've created. And we also provide services through our consultancy business, which is the next slide, wholly owned by the charity, and it works through the development life cycle, from very early stage strategic planning, helping local authorities to build the evidence base for health and well-being, through to pre-planning support, acting as a critical friend with developers or housing associations, and the missing piece in the housing puzzle, which is post-occupancy evaluation. So it's talking to people about where they live to find out how they think and feel about their surroundings, and whether their homes and neighbourhoods are good for them or not. And then finally, we next slide, we publish all this through reports that will then hopefully lead to best practice guidance for industry. So we've just produced an inclusive engagement toolkit through a university project that we've been doing called CCQual, and we're also feeding into the National Planning Policy Framework, which is undergoing a review at the moment, which is as inconsistent as you might imagine from a government that is struggling to address its many and varied priorities at the moment. So what about older people? I thought I'd take us back to the framework and try to just highlight some of the things that we found out that would be relevant to older people, and hopefully it'll be some pause for thought. So first of all, in a sense of control, we identify the need for, stick with that one. We think that a sense of influence or control has really positive effects on people. A 2021 study showed the positive influence of a sense of control or influence on physical, behavioural and psychological health in older adults. These included increased physical activity, reduced sleep problems, higher life satisfaction, higher optimism, higher purpose, lower rates of depression and hopelessness, decreased loneliness, and increased contact with friends. Older people, particularly those who are marginalised or on lower incomes, don't participate as much in decisions affecting their area, which means the need to go out and speak to them where they live and spend time, which is something we did in our Harlow and Gilston Garden Town project via the Community Builders project partner there. So we visited a weekly older persons group that our community researchers attended and spoke to people about what they felt about Harlow and the surrounding area, and their thoughts about what they needed, what they valued in their current context, and their fears around change. And as the RTPI and the Centre for Better Ageing have pointed out, older people have a voice in determining, or should have a voice in determining what is the right housing for them, so that planners create places where people of all ages are able to live healthy and active later lives. So it's really about improving that sense of influence and that sense of agency that people have in their lives. The next slide. The quality of housing relates to the way a home is designed, the amount of and flexibility of space, levels of comfort, so it's neither too hot nor too cold, indoor air quality, sound insulation, ventilation, daylight levels, and external space. Our belief is that homes should be accessible and adaptable, which means that if the occupant becomes disabled or infirm, then the house can be converted to their needs. English building regulations only require regulators to build to the kind of minimal standards in this regard, but local planning policy can go further, and it should be pushed. Scottish regulations go a little further, but they do stop short of lifetime homes, which is what we'd like to see. Next slide. Contact with nature on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour and minute-by-minute basis is central to our well-being as humans. Many studies have shown that contact with nature, even just a green view from our window, is good for our mood and aids our recovery when we're ill. But there are significant disparities in access to nature, meaning that older people, as well as Black people and people with lower incomes, are less likely to benefit from the natural environment. We recommend that people carry out a neighbourhood audit or create a community map of their green spaces, and not just the recreational spaces, but all green spaces from parks to private gardens. How much space is there? How many trees? How much is publicly accessible? Google Earth photos can be useful in doing this, but is there space that needs to be improved or that could be taken over by the community, which is all activities that older people can get involved in. Next slide. The playful city, we're told, is the child-friendly city, but play is not just for children. It's what we all do when we meet friends for a drink, when we play sport, go to the cinema or a bowling alley or a bowling green, walk in the park or ramble in the countryside. Play is what we do with our leisure time and should be woven into the fabric of our towns and cities. The 8 to 80 cities movement believes that if everything we do in our cities is great for an 80-year-old and an 80-year-old, then it will be great for all people. Older people need to play, which requires space where it can happen. Parks and other open spaces are vital, but so too are so-called third spaces. These third spaces are neither public nor private, but provide spaces for people to come together and socialise. The pub is obviously a very important one of these third spaces, but in many communities, other third spaces include cafes, community halls, and places of worship. This is the community infrastructure, which is so important to building those connections that we've heard about elsewhere. Next slide. While having access to a car may be good for our quality of life because we can get about, so is driving less. Getting out and about on foot or cycle isn't just good for physical health, It enables the day-to-day interactions that also promote connectedness that we've heard about today and reduce loneliness in turn. In our resident reviews of new developments and our surveys looking at existing housing association neighbourhoods, the ability to get about is a key problem faced by old generations. Research by Sastrans has shown that people aged 50 to 70 do not all have the same capabilities, opportunities and motivations, which requires a granular understanding and approach to encouraging more healthy ways to get around. Tackling car dependency can come through community transport solutions, such as minibuses and car shares, but it also needs to be built into neighbourhoods. First, by carefully choosing where those neighbourhoods should be built, and secondly, with design choices that encourage safe walking and cycling for everyone. Next slide. So which are the strongest communities? Those where everyone is the same or those where everyone is different? The view of planners and researchers like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has tended to be that diverse communities are best. One encouraging result in our Harlow and Gilston Garden Town project, 80% of residents over 64 felt that they strongly or fairly strongly belonged to their immediate neighbourhood, a figure only shared with 24 to 35-year-olds. But there are strong communities that can be quite homogenous where values are shared. A London-based study found that ethnic diversity is positively related to perceived social cohesion, but the positive effect of diversity on social cohesion is greater for young people than in older age groups. To get around this challenge, we believe that the successful integration of older people into mixed neighbourhoods with a wide range of people is good for everyone. This points to Wilhelmina's previous comment about placing housing for older people in places with better social connections, and this placement of housing in mixed communities makes life more interesting, broadens our outlook and makes us more tolerant. Creating mixed communities can be difficult, particularly given funding and development criteria, but a mix of houses and apartments of different sizes, along with supported housing, housing for older people, co-housing and even student blocks all contribute to that mix. Next slide. That's given you hopefully a kind of taster of what we're about. These are some of the people we've been working with. We are actually looking at, I've just been off a call today from a group of universities who represent through Trude and the TCPA on a potential research project on loneliness, which is something that we hope to develop potentially from the autumn onwards. Next slide. Thanks once again for listening today, and if you have any comments or you'd like to follow up, then do please contact us on the website. Thank you.
Matthew, thanks very much for a real comprehensive overview of both your work, but also the importance of thinking about the quality of life in terms of our lives and all people's lives, in both in community, but also creating the types of spaces that people want to live in, whether it's in their own homes, but also in that wider community. And I think the points that you raised feed in really neatly to what's come through the other speakers as well. We've got about 20 so minutes for Q&A and panel debate. And can I thank everybody who's already posted questions into the box, and we're going to go through those in a minute. But before I do so, I was just wondering whether any of the speakers wanted just to come back on any points that they've been stimulated to get or recalled, or want to sort of question one of their fellow speakers as well, because I think there are a number of points that have come up which sort of resonate with each of you. So just before we go into the Q&A, any observations from any of you? Michael?
It was just the part in building design really, because say with EngAGED Lives, it was very much about what we can do with the residents kind of socially. But if you haven't got the environment to do that in, it can become very hard. And if how people live, encouraging people to meet in social areas and have social spaces for people isn't thought about at a design stage, it's really, really hard then, isn't it, to bring people together. Even with projects like the one I was talking about, you really need both the built environment and the social environment working simultaneously together. So it was really interesting for me looking at the other presentations, that all the things in there about built environment.
No, that's great. And any other comments?
I think
raise your hand to just chip in.
I think one of the difficulties is when you have a business model that's built on providing units of housing that don't necessarily look at the broader context of home and how it sits within the neighbourhood and how those social interactions take place. So it is very much about the neighbourhood and the way in which it's designed to maximize those connections and make sure that there are the walking routes, that there are the park benches or the places for people to sit or talk. There's the community infrastructure, the third places, all of which go to making a successful neighbourhood.
Robin or Wilhelmina, any immediate thoughts?
No, I think that, sorry.
Wilhelmina.
Okay, now, but I think we are also discussing this loneliness now more and more in Sweden. We are really going to have a huge webinar, the 3 competence centers, one for family carers, one for elderly care, and one for dementia care. So I think the discussion is on, and also how to live a good life is in Sweden. So we are on the same way, I think, but I believe that you're done much more than we have at the moment. Thank you.
And Robin, your charity's been spearheading a lot of this as well. So any comments from you first?
Yeah, no, well, I think what I would say is that what we've been doing in the UK, and we actually have a remarkably an EU-funded project that we're still a part of, including with Regional Farmland in Sweden. And I think probably what I notice looking at other Northern European countries is that we've probably been more explicit about it, but in many ways we're doing things that have been that kind of common sense for some time, but just the kind of this research and evidence behind it gives it extra weight and possibly some better ways of targeting it as well. And I think Michael's point about how the kind of relatively more social group things that he was doing relied on the kind of infrastructure already being there. I think one of the things that we are interested in is both making sure that we get it right first time with new development, but also most places that we'll be living in, even in 2050, have already been built. So we're very interested in how we can do retrofit as well to existing communities. And there's some lovely examples of that as well.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and we may come back to that in a minute. Well, I'm going to kick off by just going through some of the questions. If it's okay with you, I shall use it sort of as the speaker sort of order as well. So, Michael, we're going to kick off with you first of all. A lot of congratulations for what you shared with us. A couple of sort of first question, one from Christine and one from Jane. Great to hear from both of you. Has the project methodology been written up and is it available to share for shared learning? And Jane, building on that, is there a plan to roll out nationally? Now, you talked about rolling out within ExtraCare Charitable Trust, but have you got any plans to think more broadly? Because I think a later question, maybe in Christine again, also talked about how replicable could it be in other settings.
Yeah, it would be really good to roll out to people outside of ExtraCare as well, because that was always part of the original plan. So what we wanted to do was, whenever we ran an EngAGED Lives workshop where we had residents, those 10 residents coming to that group and going through the materials, the intention was always to have older people from the local community who didn't live in the village but were still fairly local to come in and join that. So you've got half of the room made up of residents who live in ExtraCare and half of the room made up of people living in in the wider community. We couldn't do that because the pandemic put an end to it. We wanted to get the EngAGED live sessions right first and then open it up. But by the time we came to open it up, we couldn't have people coming into the building. So when we roll out to each of the locations with the EngAGED Live workshops, we definitely want to then extend that invite to older people living locally, because I think the materials are as relevant to them living in their own home in the community as they are to the resident living in the village. And it would be nice to see residents then interacting with the older people locally as well. So that is part of the plan, and it's something we just didn't get the opportunity to do on the original run. And we can absolutely as well give out the materials that show how we developed them, how we developed the workbook, what it includes, and then the full write-up that went to the big lottery fund. So the year 3 annual report is probably the best description of the project as a whole that people can look at. And I do think it is something that can be replicated, definitely.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it was Anne who asked that question, not Christine, but Christine asked one of the early ones. And I know Sally posted the link to a blog that Michael Roberts wrote for the LIN. And in fact, he did a brilliant happy hour for us last year. And there's some links in that as well to some of the materials that you've shared this morning. There are some other questions for you further down, but I'm going to move on to Wilhelmina, if that's okay. Alison asked about, picked up a point that you talked about the local neighbours, and bear in mind what Matthew was saying about how to engage with neighbourhoods. You talked, Wilhelmina, about some of your neighbours objecting initially and were making complaints. But those sound like they've been overcome. Can you just describe that a little bit more?
Well, from the beginning, from the start, we didn't do anything. We invited all the neighborhood to the foundation and described what we were supposed to do. And we listened to the ideas, so we changed for the neighbors. But then there was 2 neighbors that didn't want us to start building for people with dementia, because there is this attitude that you think that people with dementia or cognitive problems are another type of persons. I think they were really afraid of this. So they could complain, and we are living in a democracy. Thanks for that. But then you can complain and complain and complain. So now they are not allowed to complain anymore. It's gone to the highest place. So now we can do that. So I think it's about attitude, about people with cognitive problem, dementia. Still it's us.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's an inbuilt discrimination around some of this, yes, and our attitudes need to be addressed. There are some other questions for you, Wilhelmina. Christine asked a question about, does Silvio Bo operate in the UK? I think you're specific to Sweden, but are there other opportunities to link in with you? I know that as the LIN is working with Bowclock and IKEA and other projects, which we look forward to promoting in due course. But are there other sort of international participations that
yes,
Bo are involved in?
Yes, you can contact me, so I can provide you with the contacts to the Bowclock, the Skanska building company. So that's not a problem. Just email me.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that Skanska and Bowclock are working with many local authorities. And in fact, Matthew, you may have contact with some of those as well, in terms of looking at sort of regeneration and thinking about new townscapes as well in the UK. That's great. And you've also really impressed Marilyn, who also wished she could live in Sweden as well. And so that's brilliant. And again, there's some other questions from Rachel about making contacts. So thanks very much for making yourself available for further discussion. But I think Monica asked a particular question about how was the experience of collaborating with people with cognitive impairment, and what have you got in terms of that, in terms of the home design? And you shared a picture of the slide with the Queen and the King of Sweden. Yes. Are you aware of how they engage with your guests or your customers?
Do you mean that our guests are involved in the project of developing good housing?
Yeah.
Yes, they were with us from the beginning, and we are working a lot with younger persons with dementia. They are from 43 years of age. Some of them are 85, still very young in the mindset. So we discussed what could this be good, and then we tried solutions, and we got some information. No, you cannot do the staircase like this because I cannot understand where the steps are. So we had a real good cooperation with persons with cognitive problems. We learned a lot.
Well,
and I think that's the only way to do it, whatever you do. Yes.
And we look forward to sharing that after this event with everybody who's registered for this session. I'm going to move on to a couple of questions I think that were sort of for Robin. One was about looking at statistics and understanding by regional area and sub areas. Does that data exist? Is it stuff that you pull together, or the ONS, or can you just sort of give us some insight into that, please?
Yes, so there is ONS data by local authority, which I will pop into the Q&A. And there's also there's been some really interesting work that we drew on grouping together different types of local authorities to then try to see which then gave us the numbers to go into kind of the types of areas that were more or less lonely during lockdown. And some of those themes were things that you probably couldn't do very much about, kind of rural areas during lockdown were less lonely than other areas, but some of them were quite interesting. So areas with a lot of independent shops had smaller increases in loneliness than areas without, and quite similar areas without. So that kind of, I think, tells us something about the role of the kind of private sector as well as the kind of public and voluntary sectors in helping to create kind of thriving communities. And it, I think, tells us something quite important about that. And then, so that's all ONS data. What we've been doing in the last couple of years is picking up a particular ONS data series and then analysing that every couple of months to see the kind of shorter term changes in levels of loneliness, which have essentially told us that loneliness didn't go up at the beginning of the pandemic. People's existing resilience, kind of, people were a bit lonely, but they wouldn't say that they were lonely all the time. And then it was really the kind of winter lockdowns that really sent it really very, very significantly up. And then we've never quite got back to normal since then, I think, reflecting the way in which for some people who are already in a fairly good state, they'll be able to snap back into life quite straightforwardly. But for many others, it's been a more difficult process, and people have missed out on kind of, for example, younger people forming romantic relationships. As young people got fewer of them than
I'm also just wanted to just touch on a question that Janet raises, and I think you mentioned this also in your presentation, Robin, which is around the streetscaping, and I think you mentioned benches, about creating connected places. And she asked him, she recalls sometime when she was in New York, people asked where they wanted street benches. Are there any similar sort of national approaches that you're familiar with? And I think you may have touched on some of it in your built environment toolkit.
Yeah, that's right. So in general, no, this is something which is very much kind of about local authorities really being in the drivers. I think the other, I think where they exist, parish and town councils can also play a really important role in that very kind of focused local way. So yes, in general, this is the kind of thing which doesn't happen at a kind of big city level. It tends to be much more kind of happen at a much lower level. And there was also a question, I think, asking, I think from Tim, so a lot of the examples here focused on kind of spatial strategies, but
yeah,
kind of movement. And I think that is, to be honest, it was actually one of the things which kind of motivated me to want to do this work, which is that, for example, in physical activity over the last decade, it's become much more normalized that people are not going to get the physical activity they need by driving to a gym and running on a machine. People do it just by building it into their day-to-day lives. And I think what struck me is that we've done that for physical activity and movement We haven't done it for loneliness, and I think what would be really valuable would be to make loneliness and social connection just as a normal part of how we analyse any area and how we can kind of maximise for it. So the answer to the question is, I think we absolutely see the importance of how you get about as being really important. The kind of 15-minute neighbourhood concept, I think, is really relevant to this. That kind of, you know, just if you live somewhere that where you bump into people, you know, that's all, but because you're walking around rather than kind of locked away in a car, that's always going to be a much more kind of social and friendly way of engaging with people. So yeah, the answer is existing work, not nearly enough. And what we want to inspire over the coming years is for kind of how people get about to be much more built into tackling loneliness. And that also goes for public transport. You can run public transport is valuable for coming together. You can also run buses in ways that create opportunities for connection, or not. Some colleagues of mine are working in a kind of sister organisation, working with London buses and encouraging bus drivers and passengers to say hello to each other, because at the moment the kind of barriers and the social norms have really kind of gone away from that. But bus drivers love it when people talk to them in general, it turns out. It's just that we've just kind of drifted out doing so.
Yeah, no, that's really, and I think you touched on Tim's question. I'll come back to that because I think it's also important for Matthew. And I've actually judged several of Tim's schemes that have won and been shortlisted for the Housing Design Awards. And interestingly, you also had a slide, Robin, with Mole Architects and Marmalade Lane Co-Housing, which was again a Housing Design Award winner. But I know, Matthew, having worked closely with you and your organisation and judging other schemes, you know, this issue around spatial and sort of thinking about the spatial and the sort of the ownership and models. You highlighted stuff about integrating communities, and I wonder whether you could just think about that in terms spatially and perhaps also intergenerationally as well, to combat loneliness.
Yeah, I just think
extending Tim's question a little bit, if I may, take the chair's privilege.
I just think in terms of the way in which large-scale regeneration schemes or large-scale master plans for new developments are considered, there's a need to build in the diversity that do make successful places, because if you're just designing for one particular demographic, then you build in a level of homogeneity that I don't think is as healthy as it might be. I grew up in a house where we were 4 generations strong living under the same roof, and I think that intergenerational learning and sharing and the sense of belonging that you get from being in that environment is really enriching. And I think to isolate old people in places over there, or to kind of build walls around them is really counterproductive. So anyways, it was good to hear from Michael and from Wilhelmina ways in which they look to build those connections with others in the community. And I think if you can do that spatially, if you can do that through a master plan or through a regeneration project where you think, okay, we've got the school, which is obviously the one that gets the biggest plaudits, but also the older people's provision, and what that means in terms of the social infrastructure and the ways of getting about and the places for connection and all of those things that Robin's already identified to do with the neighbourhood, then that seems to me a much healthier and more kind of realistic community to aspire to.
Well, thanks for that. And Michael, can I just come back to you, because Tim's question also just spurred in my head anyway, you know, some of the things that you described at Longbridge, you know, the deck access and about creating spaces for movement, indoors and outdoors. You've got the roof garden, you've got the green space. Any thoughts about that in terms of the spatial strategy and the creating that identity of ownership of those schemes through your work around Better Lives?
Yeah, it's actually been something that's been added to our research and innovation strategy, that actually the outdoor spaces need to be as important as the indoor spaces, and actually how can we bring the outdoors indoors a little bit more as well. So actually at Larkhill Village, when there was refurbished Larkhill Village in Nottingham, it's recently just had things like a living wall put in, quite a large living wall, and it's very unusual to walk into the village and see it, but it's lovely. You instantly get this hit of green, and so not really a design feature that we would have included many years ago. I mean, I've been with ExtraCare 15 years now, so it was brand new for me. And even just outside Longbridge, where you haven't got a great deal of outdoor space, but what we do with it, like having the roof terrace because there's not as much garden, and having lots of seating out there, and actually making it look like a space where people want to actually go, making it easy for people to say take things like food and drink up there. If none of these spaces exist and they haven't been thought about, you just end up with, yes, your village centre, which can sometimes be far away from some apartments, and corridors. And actually corridors just feel very functional. They're just places to get from A to B. And actually they need to kind of sit, and residents will, if they see someone sitting, say hello. They're very good at saying good morning to each other. Whereas I know at my age, when I walk down the street, I can walk down the street pretty much interrupted. But if I go from the front door of the village to a resident's apartment, chances are a good number of people are actually going to stop and say hello to me. And you can see people sitting and doing things in those spaces that just looks like normal everyday life, and a happy life as well, rather than just people passing each other and ignoring each other.
Look, we're approaching the end. I want to sort of hand back to each of you as presenters. I think there was one question to Wilhelmina that I managed to forget. Let me just scroll up and see if I can find that. But while I'm doing that, are there any final comments that each of you will want to make? And if I go in reverse order, Matthew, if we start off with you. Sorry,
the question again?
If there's any final comments that you would like to make from this session, any learning points that you've picked up, for example?
It's really encouraging to see so much kind of common thinking in this space, and I always come away from these things thinking, can we just join them all up?
Well, that's what we do at the LIN, so I'm glad you do network with us. But Robin, any thoughts from you?
I similarly also wanted to thank you ever so much for inviting us to this. I think that it's really important that we understand both how much kind of joy and pleasure acting to do all the kinds of things that we've been talking about can give to people, but it can also help to prevent and alleviate loneliness, something which can have a really deep and devastating impact on people's lives and their mental and physical health as well. And there's just so many ways in which we can do that. And just to kind of respond to Michael's last point, that it really is the case that access to greenery is one way in which we can feel better connected. And so things like living walls and roof terraces really are a part of this answer. And so thanks again for
our pleasure. Thanks for joining us. Wilhelmina, the question that was for you was about, do you do any work around reducing falls in design? I don't know if you have any specific examples, or we can come back to Jane, who raised that question at a later date. But if you'd like to answer that, that'd be great. Otherwise, any general observations that you would like to share from this morning's session?
Well, about falls, shortly, we have some, research when it comes to falls, and to avoid things in the home that makes you fall, for example, rugs or very much furniture, etc., etc. But we have research, we are of course thinking of this, but it's not like special floors in the housing. It's ordinary, often wooden floors. And I would like to thank you for letting me in. Just working with, not just, but I think that if you create a society that is possible to live with cognitive problems, it's a good society for everyone, not just thinking about other things like physical handicaps. And I'd like to this, that to empower the individuals, create opportunities in the societies, indoors, outdoors, everywhere, of course, and create collaborations. And I think we can see those shops that were making adaptations for people with cognitive problems. They kept their customers, they earn more money. If they hadn't done that, they had lost their customers. So we have to think in so many ways how to create a good world to live in and for the future. Thank you. I'm happy to be joining you here today.
Well, thank you, and really well said. I'm going to give Michael the final word as both sponsor of this session, but also kicking it off. So, Michael.
Just that loneliness isn't inevitable for everybody, and also it's not, if it does creep into someone's life, it's not an impossible thing to tackle. When I said in my presentation, when I got given the project, I thought, oh, loneliness, what on earth are we going to do? Actually, there's loads of stuff we can do, and really, really helpful things as well.
Well, look, thank you, all of you, for wonderful contributions. I know that the chat box and the Q&A, everybody's been really impressed, and I'm sure there'll be follow-up questions and contacts made. If anybody is interested in some of the other themes that we've got during the week, they touch on points that have been raised on design. We've got a session on design for healthy aging. We've got the University of Worcester and the Association for Dementia Studies joining us with the work that they've been doing on ExtraCare and commissioners on Thursday. We will continue these debates and dialogues and network with all of you, both during this week, but beyond. But it just leaves me to thank ExtraCare Charitable Trust for being such a fabulous sponsor of the LIN and supporting us for this particular session. Our 4 fantastic speakers, thank you very much, Matthew, Robin, Wilhelmina and Michael. Thanks Sally and Jerome, who've been really busy behind the scenes, answering questions, moving on slides, dealing with other matters as well. And as we said right at the outset, a recording and a PowerPoint presentations will be available to you if you've been watching, and for those people who've been registered for this session. And thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at a next session or a future happy hour. Thanks a lot and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.